My mother tore a photograph in half in front of me on a Sunday afternoon in July. That's where I'll start because that's the moment everything changed. And I think you deserve to know the truth before I slow things down and tell it right. My name is Sable Renee Carter. I was 25 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed one simple thing about my family, that no matter what, blood meant shelter. I believed it the way you believe the sun will rise quietly without needing proof. I was about to learn that belief was the most expensive thing I ever owned. Here's what you don't know yet. 3 years before that Sunday, I turned down a job in Dallas that would have doubled my pay so I could stay home and nurse my grandmother through the last 18 months of her life. 4 years before that Sunday, I signed my name on a loan I never got to spend a single dollar of. And on that Sunday, standing in my mother's living room with a 1-month-old baby against my chest, I didn't know that the very people telling me to leave were the ones who owed me the most. There was a man, too, who owed me an apology he hadn't paid yet. A man who, 18 months from that Sunday, would pull up outside a farmer's market in a line of cars long enough to stop traffic. He didn't know it yet either. Neither of us did. This isn't a story about a stranger's cruelty. This is the kind of thing that happens behind a closed front door where nobody outside ever hears the sentence that breaks somebody, and the people doing the breaking still show up smiling at church the very next Sunday. That's the part they never expected me to find out. Stay with me. It was a Sunday in July. Houston heat, the kind that presses down on your shoulders like a hand. We'd just come home from Mount Olive Baptist, still in our church clothes. Zion was 1 month old. He weighed nothing in my arms and everything in my chest. My mother, Odessa Carter, stood in the middle of the living room like she was standing at a pulpit. Sunday dress, rust-colored gold buttons down the front. Her chin lifted the way it did any time she wanted a room to understand she was finished discussing something. I'd seen that tilt 1,000 times. I had never once seen it aimed at me like a weapon. Sable, she said. Just my name. The room went cold. Even in that thick Houston heat, it went cold. Somewhere behind her, the ceiling fan turned slow, tired circles, doing nothing but push the heat from one corner of the room to another. I could still smell last night's smothered chicken faint in the kitchen air, the lemon polish she rubbed into the coffee table every Saturday like it was scripture. My grandmother's old recipe box sat on the counter where she'd left it, corners soft from years of hands going through it, a coffee stain on the pound cake card she used to say happened the morning of my christening and never once let anybody clean off. Outside, the porch swing creaked the same way it had since sometime during the Eisenhower administration, or so my daddy always joked whenever anybody asked why he never oiled the chain. I remember thinking foolishly that it was just another Sunday. My father Bernard sat in his leather chair by the window, the one with the worn armrest where his elbow had rested every evening for 20 years. He didn't look at me. He looked out at the driveway like the hydrangeas suddenly needed his undivided attention. He had always been a quiet man, but his silence that Sunday had a different weight. It sat in the room like a third person nobody had invited. My little sister Lila leaned against the wall near the hallway 23, dressed like she was headed somewhere far more interesting than her parents' living room. Bright crop top, gold hoops, hair freshly done. Her phone was already raised. It took me a second to understand what the little red light in the corner of the screen meant. She was recording. "You have disrespected this family," my mother said before I'd even set my purse down. "You have humiliated us in front of the whole congregation. A baby Sable, no husband, no ring, no plan." She said the word plan like something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. I told her Rome had promised he'd come back, that he just needed time, that things were complicated with his family, that I still believed him, God help me, standing right there with the evidence of his absence sleeping against my chest. She cut me off before I finished the sentence, the way she'd been cutting me off since I was maybe 6 years old. "You will give that baby up for adoption," she said flat and final, "or you will leave this house today." Sit with that sentence for a second the way I had to. Not, we need to talk. Not, let's figure this out together. An ultimatum delivered in the exact same even tone she used to announce the church bake sale sign-up sheet. I said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just said no, quiet as I could manage, and I held my son a little tighter against me, like my arms alone could be a wall. My father stood up. He still didn't look at me. He crossed the room, opened the hall closet, and took out a small metal box I recognized instantly. The one I'd kept hidden behind the winter coats where I'd stashed every dollar I'd managed to save from 4 years of double shifts as a line cook. He counted it out loud in front of me, bill by bill, like he was doing inventory at the end of a shift. $412. He set it on the coffee table, not toward me, just on the table, like evidence. My mother went down the hall and came back with a black garbage bag already half full. She'd emptied my dresser into it without folding a single thing. Then she reached back in and pulled one small item back out, setting it aside on the table like a consolation prize, a thin silver bangle, my grandmother's, the only piece of jewelry that had ever meant anything to me. "You can keep that," she said, like it was a mercy. I reminded her quietly not to start a fight, just to be heard one time before I walked out that door about the loan. 4 years earlier, I'd signed my name on a personal loan that funded Lila's very first attempt at opening a clothing boutique downtown. I never saw $1 of it touch my own hand. I paid it down anyway every month because it had my name on it, and my name was about the only thing I had that still felt like mine. My mother laughed. Not cruel exactly, something worse. A tired, dismissive little laugh, the kind you give a child stating something obvious. "That's what daughters do," she said. "Don't you dare stand in my living room and act like you're owed something for it." I bent down to pick up the bangle where it had slipped near the front step. A small folded scrap of paper came loose from the garbage bag and fluttered out onto the porch beside it. I recognized the handwriting the second I unfolded it. My cousin Tripp hadn't spoken to him in over a year. "They've been planning this since you were 3 months pregnant. Don't believe any promise about keeping things for you." I didn't have time to sit with what that meant. My mother had already spotted the one photograph I'd managed to save, the only picture I had left of me and my grandmother together. She snatched it out of my hand before I could stop her, to oar it clean in half, and drop both pieces into the kitchen trash without so much as blinking. A curtain shifted in the window of the house across the street. I didn't turn to look. I already knew someone was watching. I walked out into the full weight of a Houston July afternoon, my suitcase dragging behind me on wheels that caught in every crack of the sidewalk, Zion crying against my chest because he was hungry, and because I believe now babies understand things long before we ever tell ourselves they do. That first night, I slept sitting upright on a bench in the waiting room at Bentop Hospital because it was air-conditioned, because it was safe, and because I genuinely had nowhere else in the world to go. I fed my son formula, bought with coins dug out from the bottom of my purse. Somewhere around 3 a.m, with his small warm weight finally settling into sleep against me, I whispered the only promise I had left to give him. "I won't let anyone look at you with pity, not ever." All I knew standing at that bus stop, with my son against my chest and my whole life folded into one suitcase, was this: if I was still standing tomorrow, nobody would ever get to write my story for me again. 3 months after I walked out of my parents' house, I was working the back kitchen at Pearl's Diner on Dowling Street, a narrow little place with a hand-painted sign out front and a bell over the door that never quite rang true. My hands cracked from the dishwater within the first 2 weeks. My lower back ached by 2 p.m. and never really let up before closing. Zion slept in a second-hand stroller behind the prep counter, wrapped in that same yellow blanket because it was the one piece of home I had left to give him. Pearl Washington was 61 years old, built low and solid, like she'd been carved rather than born. She didn't ask me questions. She just left a phone container of whatever hadn't sold that evening on the corner of my station most nights and said the same 4 words on her way out the back door. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow's still coming. There's a particular kind of kindness that doesn't announce itself. And Pearl's kindness was exactly that kind. Some nights, standing over the fryer around 11 o'clock with my feet screaming inside my shoes, my mind would drift back to a decision I'd made 3 years before any of this. A restaurant group out of Dallas had offered me a sous chef position once real money, a real title. I turned it down flat because my grandmother had just been diagnosed with the cancer that would eventually take her. I gave her 18 months of my life gladly. After the funeral, my mother looked at me across that same kitchen table where I'd once done my homework as a girl and said plain as anything, "You made your choice to stay home. Don't come around here now blaming your circumstances on the rest of us." I never forgot that sentence. On weekends, I started selling little butter cookies out front of Pearl's Diner, $2 a bag, a recipe I remembered from my grandmother's own dented mixing bowl. A few of the regulars started asking for them by name within a month. I kept every dollar folded tight inside an old coffee tin under my mattress. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Pearl called me back into the little office behind the kitchen and handed me an envelope, the paper gone soft at the corners. "I'm not just giving you cash out of the kindness of my heart," she said low. "I've seen your daddy parked out front of this diner twice now, sitting in his car with men in suits, the kind that come around asking after folks who owe somebody money. I told him I never heard of any Sable Carter. They don't know you're back here in my kitchen because I made good and sure of that myself." I wrapped my fingers around my grandmother's silver bangles so tight the metal left a mark against my palm. I just nodded and I went back out to the stove because that's what you learn to do when the ground keeps shifting under you. Money got tight fast after that conversation. My landlord raised the rent on the little room I was renting above the laundromat with no warning at all. Zion spiked a fever one night that scared me more than almost anything ever had, and I ran 6 blocks in the dark to a free clinic with him wrapped tight to my chest. That same week, an old flip phone I'd found in a trash bin behind the diner lit up one evening with a text from a number I didn't know. "I know where you are." My stomach dropped clean through the floor before the second message even finished loading. "Lila's video is up for sale. If you want it gone, answer before morning." I sat down hard on the floor of that little room, my back against the wall. Zion finally asleep against my shoulder, and I made myself breathe slow. I didn't answer that text. I told myself whoever it was could sit and wait until sunrise because I had nothing left in me that particular night besides getting my son safely through his fever. The next afternoon, during a slow lull between lunch and dinner, I sat down at Pearl's old office computer and did something I probably shouldn't have. I logged into an account I still technically had access to, a joint statement tied to the very loan I'd been paying down for Lila's boutique just to check the balance one more time. What I found on that screen stopped me cold. 2 weeks after I walked out of that house my parents had used, my own credit history, my name, my social security number, the very same one still tied to that old loan to open a brand new line of credit. Not a small one either. I sat there staring at the numbers with my hands shaking, and something in me that had still foolishly been holding on to some soft and hopeful idea about my parents finally let go for good. Quiet as a held breath finally released. That night I locked the door to my little room twice, checked it a third time out of pure habit, and pulled Zion in tight against my chest. "Nobody touches you," I whispered into his hair. "Nobody." I filed a fraud report that week, sitting on hold with the credit bureau for the better part of an hour while Zion napped in his stroller behind the counter. I printed out every statement I could get my hands on, tucking the folder inside an old cookbook of my grandmother's for safekeeping. Because here's the thing about being pushed all the way down to the floor. You find out exactly what you're made of when you're the one who has to get back up off it. If my family thought a torn photograph and an empty dresser was the end of my story, they hadn't seen anything yet. This whole drama family mess they built without me knowing, the loan, the account, the silence was about to become the exact thing that undid them. Here's what I want to know from you before we go any further. If it were your name on that stolen credit line, would you have called the police that same night, or would you have done exactly what Sable did and quietly built your case first, letting them believe they'd gotten away with it? Pick one. Type, call it in, or build the case in the comments, and tell me why in one sentence. I'm reading every single one. 18 months after I walked out of my parents' house, I was standing behind a folding table at the Saturday market near Herman Park selling butter cookies and lemon bars out of a stack of mismatched tins, Zion playing at my feet with a set of plastic dinosaurs. It was an ordinary Saturday right up until the moment it wasn't. I heard the engines before I ever saw them. A low, heavy rumble that didn't belong anywhere near the usual Saturday traffic circling the park. 5 black SUVs pulled up along the curb in a tight, deliberate line. The whole market seemed to hold its breath at once. The back door of the last SUV opened, and Rome Ellison stepped out onto the curb. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe just harder filled out into his shoulders in a way he hadn't been at 22, dressed in a dark suit that fit him like it had been built directly around his body. His eyes moved slowly over the crowd, and then they found me, and everything about him went completely still. He crossed the market toward my table, and the crowd parted around him. "Sable," he said. His voice cracked slightly right there on my name. "Don't say my name like you still have the right to it," I told him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He got down on one knee right there on the pavement in front of half of Herman Park. He told me his father had shipped him off to a business program in Germany within weeks of finding out I was pregnant, had taken his phone away, his passport, kept him boxed in so thoroughly there'd been nothing left for him to even come back to. There was a small smudge of blue ink on the cuff of his crisp white shirt sleeve, faded, half washed out, but unmistakably shaped like the little diner logo Pearl used to stamp onto her tip envelopes by hand. I stared at it a second too long, and he saw exactly where my eyes had gone. He lowered his voice until it was pitched for only me to hear. "I've had someone put cash into that diner's tip jar every single week for the last 7 months," he said. "Not to buy your forgiveness. I know money can't do that. Just to make sure the two of you were eating." Wrong didn't kneel on that pavement hoping to be forgiven. Some part of him already understood forgiveness wasn't his to ask for yet. What he wanted more than absolution was to no longer be the man who disappeared. 7 months of quiet envelopes weren't a bribe. They were the only language he had left to prove he'd changed, because words had already failed him once in front of the same woman, in front of the same kind of silence his own father had trained into him. He told me something else, too, how he'd finally managed to trace me down. A story Lila had posted online, laughing to her followers about how my sister's selling cookies on a street corner now, the location in the background blurred, but not nearly blurred enough. I reached into the front pocket of my bag and pulled out the one photograph I still carried of Rome and me. I put it into his open hand. "You made a promise standing in front of this exact picture once," I said. "Now you show up with a convoy of cars? I don't need your apology, Rome. I need you to disappear before my son grows old enough to understand what the word father is even supposed to mean." I bent down and lifted Zion up onto my hip, and I turned my back on him, walking straight through a crowd of strangers already holding their phones up. I let my voice carry loud enough that whatever microphone happened to be nearby caught the very last thing I said to him that afternoon. "Nice cars. They don't feed the child you left behind." That night, a thick envelope showed up outside the door of my little apartment. Inside was a temporary guardianship waiver, signed and notarized, giving me sole, uncontested authority over every single decision involving my son. Beneath the papers was a single line written in his own handwriting. I'll prove it with actions, not words. I sat with that envelope in my lap for a long while before I finally let myself sleep that night. Wrong seemed to believe that money given quietly enough and long enough could somehow undo what he'd done. I decided right then that I was going to show him exactly what money was actually good for. A tool, nothing more than that. Never a substitute for the years he wasn't there. For 2 months after that Saturday in Herman Park, Wrong kept his word in the smallest way a person can keep a word, by showing up every single Sunday, right on time, always with an independent guardian present, a soft-spoken older woman named Miss Franklin, who used to work in family court, hired specifically so I would never have to take his honesty on faith alone. I allowed all of it. I did not soften toward him. There's a difference between letting a man prove something and letting him back into your life. And I held that line the way you hold a fence post steady in wet ground. I noticed small things about him in those Sunday visits. The way he'd wait for me to set Zion down before he ever reached for him, never assuming. The way he'd started keeping his sleeves rolled instead of buttoned at the wrist, like the suits didn't fit who he was trying to become anymore. Once, folding a stroller back up on my porch, he caught me watching him and just said quiet, "I know I don't get credit for showing up late. I'm not here for credit." I didn't answer him. I just nodded once and went back inside. But I thought about that sentence longer than I wanted to. One Tuesday morning in September, word started moving through the old neighborhood the way word always does there. Not loud, not all at once, but in the particular hush of women leaning close over a diner counter, lowering their voices even though there was nobody left to overhear but me. I heard it first from Pearl. She came through the swinging kitchen door with a stack of dirty plates balanced on one arm and didn't say anything for a second, just set the plates down harder than she needed to, which was how I always knew something was coming. "Your daddy's business," she said. "Word is the bank's calling in everything at once. Whole thing's folding." I didn't cry when she told me. I just went very still behind the counter, my hands flat on the cutting board, the knife I'd been using resting half an inch from my fingers, steam still curling up off the pot behind me. Somewhere in the front of the diner, the bell over the door rang and a customer laughed at something. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning, going on like nothing in the world had just tilted sideways. I thought about that metal box my father had counted out loud in front of me. $412 set down on a coffee table like evidence, like he was closing a ledger on me. And some old, stubborn, complicated part of me felt something I can only describe as the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of watching a debt finally come due. Not joy. Nothing that clean, just the low, settling feeling of a scale righting itself after years of sitting crooked. Pearl watched my face for a long moment, then reached over and turned the stove burner down without being asked, the way she always did when she could tell my hands weren't steady enough to be trusted near a flame. "You don't have to feel one particular way about this," she said. "Whatever you're feeling is allowed to be true." The night before everything came apart for good, I drove out to my old neighborhood after dark. The streetlights out that far were the kind that buzzed and flickered every few seconds, throwing the road into brief stretches of orange and brief stretches of black. I parked 2 houses down from where I used to live, out of habit more than caution, and walked the rest of the way to a storage shed behind my aunt's old property, the one my father had given me a key to when I was maybe 10 years old, back when he still looked at me like I was someone worth handing keys to. The shed smelled the way it always had, cut grass gone stale, old motor oil, a little bit of my grandmother's cedar chest underneath it all. I had to stand there a second in the dark before my eyes adjusted enough to find the string for the bare bulb overhead. When the light came on, it swung a little, throwing shadows that rocked back and forth across boxes I hadn't touched in years. Inside, tucked behind a box of my grandmother's old canning jars, was a folder I had put there myself months earlier. Every deposit I had ever made into my parents' joint account over 4 long years, printed off Pearl's office computer, dated and organized with a single line I'd written across the top in red ink. If they ever deny it, this is the answer. My hands weren't quite steady taking it down. I remember standing there with the folder against my chest, listening to a dog bark somewhere down the road, and thinking about how strange it was that the truth had been sitting this whole time in a shed nobody in that house even remembered existed, the same way I'd come to learn later a piece of land out past Sunnyside had been sitting forgotten too. My family had a habit of losing track of exactly the things that would eventually cost them the most. Beside that folder was a second, smaller stack of papers, the fraud report I'd filed the week I discovered the credit line opened in my name, along with the confirmation letter stating the account had been frozen pending investigation. I pressed both folders flat against my chest and stood there another minute in that swinging light, just breathing, before I locked the shed back up and drove home to relieve the sitter and put my son to bed. Rome brought his line of cars back to the old house in Meyerland the next afternoon, and this time he brought 3 local reporters with him, invited under the reasonable-sounding pretense of covering a small business relief initiative his company was quietly funding around the city. My parents and Lila were already out on the front porch by the time our 2 cars pulled up, the gravel crunching loud under the tires in a driveway that had gone quiet a long time ago. I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the street, ordinary and far off, the kind of sound that makes a moment feel even less real than it already does. My father stood at the top of the porch steps in his undershirt, no jacket, which I had never once seen him do in front of company in my entire life. That alone told me more about how far things had fallen than anything Pearl had said. My mother stood a step below him, arms crossed tight over her chest, jewelry gone, hair pulled back, plain instead of styled. Lila hovered near the railing, phone nowhere in sight for the first time I could remember. I stepped out of the car with both folders held against my chest. Rome addressed my father directly, loud enough for the reporters to hear clearly. "Mr. Carter, my company has purchased the outstanding debt held against your business. I wanted to deliver the paperwork in person." I watched my father's shoulders drop with relief. Watched him reach out his hand toward Rome like a man reaching for a rope thrown into a well. His eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral, and for one strange second, I almost felt something soften in my chest toward him. Some old muscle memory of wanting to run and fix whatever was breaking him. Rome didn't take his hand. Instead, he turned and looked at me and held the transfer papers out, not toward my father, toward me. The porch went silent except for a camera shutter clicking somewhere behind me, and I heard my mother's breath catch audibly, a short, sharp sound like she'd been struck. Here is the truth of where that money actually came from, because I won't have you thinking a man swept in and rescued me, because that isn't what happened. 18 months of butter cookies sold $2 a bag. 18 months of double shifts at Pearl's, every spare dollar folded into a coffee tin. And a mason jar Pearl herself had handed me 3 weeks earlier, heavier than I expected, label peeling at one corner. For Sable, it said, in her own uneven handwriting. Money regulars had been quietly dropping into it for the better part of a year. Between the tin and the jar, I had more saved than anyone in that family would have believed possible. Rome's part in it was smaller than 5 black SUVs made it look. He'd made the calls, he put his name down as guarantor so the paperwork could move at the speed his money could buy. But the debt underneath it, the dollars that mattered, that was mine. I opened the first folder and laid it flat on the porch table in front of my mother, in front of every camera pointed our way. My hands were steady. I noticed that distantly the way you notice weather. "The debt you're standing under right now," I said, "is made up almost entirely of what I put into this family for 4 years. Every deposit is dated. I'm not doing this to get even with anybody standing on this porch. I'm doing it so that nobody in this house ever again gets to tell another woman she has to leave with nothing." I set the second folder down beside the first. "This account was opened using my name 2 weeks after I was told to leave this house. without my knowledge. I've already filed the fraud report. It's frozen as of 3 weeks ago. I'm saying this in front of these cameras so it's said once clearly where everyone can hear it. Sable didn't need cameras to collect a debt. A lawyer and a bank transfer could have done that quietly without an audience. What she needed cameras for was something no courtroom could give her, back a version of the story that couldn't be edited by anyone else afterward. For 4 years, she'd let her family write the record of who she was in a house where her voice never carried past the kitchen. This time, she made sure the record was public, dated, and hers. My mother started to cry, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere old and buried, her whole body seeming to fold slightly at the shoulders. "Sable," she said, reaching a hand toward me, her fingers trembling in the air between us. "You're still daughter." Odessa's tears weren't proof of a sudden change of heart. They arrived only once the cameras did, only once the story had already slipped out of her control. Her whole life she had managed the family's image the way other people manage money, carefully, protectively, at any cost. What broke her that afternoon wasn't guilt over what she'd done to her daughter 2 years earlier. It was the sight of a narrative she could no longer edit, being told by someone she had never expected to have a voice loud enough to correct her. Beside her, my father hadn't moved. He stood with his hands still half extended toward Rome, like he hadn't caught up yet to the fact that the hand had already been declined. I watched something pass over his face that I didn't have a word for. Not quite shame, not quite fear. Something closer to a man watching a version of himself he'd never once considered finally arrive on his own porch. Lala stood frozen at the railing, both hands pressed flat over her mouth, and I saw her eyes go just once to the folder on the table, then to me, then away. She didn't say anything. Not yet. I looked at my mother for a long moment before I answered. "A daughter doesn't get her grandmother's photo torn in half in front of her own newborn son," I said. "A daughter doesn't get filmed like she's evidence in somebody else's court case. I don't know what I am to you, Mama, but I know exactly what you were to me that day, and I've carried it a long time now." I closed both folders. I lifted Zion onto my hip and I turned toward the car, walking slow and steady across that same driveway I'd once dragged a suitcase over. Rome fell into step, half a pace behind me, close enough that I felt his presence, but not close enough to touch. And just before I reached the car door, he said low, just for me, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive them. I know better than that by now." I didn't answer him either. But I let him open the car door for me, and that was answer enough for one afternoon. I didn't leave them with a clever line that day. I'd already said everything that needed saying. This whole drama family reckoning didn't need a closing sentence dressed up for effect. It just needed me to keep walking and let the silence behind me do whatever work it was going to do. The gate to that old house swung shut behind the car as we pulled away, and for the first time in 18 months, the sound of it closing didn't feel like something being shut against me. It felt like something finally being put down. 3 months after that afternoon in Maryland, I signed a lease on a narrow storefront 2 doors down from Pearl's. I called it Zion's Table. A little counter-service kitchen, nothing fancy. Hot meals sold cheap or given free to any single mother who walked through the door and needed one less thing to worry about at the end of a long day. Rome never once put his name on anything. He just quietly arranged for a produce supplier to deliver twice a week, and I led him on the clear understanding that every decision under that roof belonged to me and only me. Pearl laughed the first time she saw my sign go up, a big, open laugh that carried out onto the sidewalk. It was that same week, standing in my new kitchen with flowers still on her hands, that she told me something I'd never known in all our months working side by side. She'd been put out of her own family's house at 24 years old for reasons not so terribly different from mine. "I never told anybody that for the longest time," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, not quite looking at me while she said it. Felt like admitting somebody I loved could do that to me. She looked up at me then, and her eyes had gone glassy in a way I'd never seen on her before. Yours didn't shake once telling that story on that porch. I want you to know I noticed that. I told her I'd learned it from her, the not shaking. She just shook her head and went back to kneading dough, but she stayed a little longer in the kitchen that evening than she needed to, and neither of us said anything else about it. Some things don't need more words put on them. Lila came by on a Thursday afternoon in October. No makeup, hair pulled back, plain, wearing an old t-shirt I remembered from years before everything happened. She set her phone face down on my counter before she said a single word, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly, the same tremor I'd worked hard for months to keep out of my own. "Delete all of it," she said. I know I was wrong. I've known it a long time, honestly. I didn't hug her. I pointed instead to the hiring sign taped in my front window. "If you're serious about making this right," I told her, "you show up here tomorrow morning at 7. On time. There's no family discount on effort in this kitchen, Lila." She nodded, blinking fast, and something in her face looked younger than 23 right then, closer to the little sister who used to fall asleep on my bed during summer storms. Then quiet, she told me, our mother had once promised to sign the family house over into her name outright if she'd just keep filming, keep quiet, keep playing her part. She said it like she'd been carrying that stone a long time and had finally found somewhere safe to set it down. She did show up the next morning, 7 o'clock sharp, apron tied crooked the first few days until she learned to do it right. She burned 2 trays of cornbread her first week and cried about it in the walk-in for 10 minutes before I found her and told her Pearl had burned worse her first month too. Slowly, the girl who used to raise a phone at me instead of a hand started showing up as somebody I recognized from before all of it. Quieter now, but steadier. The kind of steady that only comes from having actually lost something first. 2 days after that first conversation, on my counter, Lila called our grandmother's old attorney herself. She asked him plainly whether there was anything in Grandma's will that our family had never bothered mentioning to me. There was. In the weeks that followed, the attorney worked steadily through the paperwork. One gray afternoon in early November, he knocked on the door of my little kitchen with a leather folder tucked under his arm. Rain coming down soft outside the window, the smell of coffee and browning butter still hanging in the air from the lunch rush. The clause, when he finally read it aloud, was simple in its wording and devastating in what it meant. My grandmother's remaining property, a modest parcel of land out past Sunnyside, would only pass to whichever heir had fully supported themselves and any children of their own for at least 24 consecutive months without accepting a single dollar of help from their parents. Clipped to the back of the clause in my grandmother's own looping handwriting was a letter. "If they ever made you leave that house, use this land to build a place for people just like you, and never under any circumstance let them set foot on it." I sat down hard on the stool behind my counter and cried for the first time in longer than I could remember. My shoulders shaking in a way I hadn't let them shake even that first night at Ben Taub. My grandmother had seen this coming long before any of the rest of us did, had folded her love for me into a legal document years before I ever needed it. Quiet the same way she'd folded 3 uneven rows into a yellow blanket, patient enough to wait for the exact moment I'd understand what she'd really given me. Christmas came that year with a card in my mailbox from my parents. I held it in my hands out on the sidewalk for a long minute, the paper cold from sitting in the box all morning, my breath fogging faintly in the December air. I didn't open it, not out of spite, more because I wasn't ready yet to know what was inside, and I'd learned, slow and hard, that I was finally allowed to wait until I was ready. I tucked it into the same cookbook where I'd once hidden my fraud report, and I let it sit there, unopened, through the rest of that winter. A year after that gray November afternoon in my kitchen, the parcel of land out past Sunnyside wasn't empty anymore. Zion's table had grown into a full community kitchen with a free morning childcare corner and a set of short courses teaching real marketable skills, knife skills, basic bookkeeping, resume writing, taught mostly by volunteers who'd once been regulars standing on the other side of my counter. On opening morning, the smell of cornbread and coffee drifted out past the front doors and into the parking lot, mixing with the sound of somebody's radio playing low gospel from an old truck parked near the entrance. The sign out front read simply, Carter Community Kitchen, founded by Sable Renee Carter. Rome stood in line with everybody else on opening day. No speech prepared, hands in his pockets, like any other guest waiting his turn. When he finally reached the front, he didn't ask for anything special. He just looked at me across the counter and said, "Whatever's good today." The exact same thing any stranger might say, and something about that ordinariness made my chest go tight in a way 5 black SUVs never had. I served him a plate like anybody else's, and he found a seat at the far end of a long table next to Zion, who climbed up beside him without being asked. Lila ran the child care corner patient in a way I hadn't seen from her before, kneeling down to tie small shoes and wipe small faces with the same steadiness she'd learned burning cornbread in my walk-in a year earlier. Pearl sat at the table of honor near the front, dressed in her Sunday best for the first time I'd ever seen outside of church, beaming at anybody who so much as glanced her way. The land itself, I'd come to learn, was the very same parcel my father had once quietly attempted to negotiate away during the worst months of his financial collapse, before discovering it had never actually belonged to him to sell. I never told him I knew that. I simply built. I didn't send an invitation to my old family for the opening. I invited instead every single mother who had ever sat at my counter eating a warm plate of food she didn't have to feel ashamed of needing. In the crowd that afternoon stood the same neighbor who used to watch from behind her window curtain the day I was put out of my parents' house. She carried a thin manila envelope pressed against her chest, and she stood at the edge of the crowd for a long while before she finally worked up the nerve to come find me, her hands visibly unsteady around the edges of the envelope. "I filmed it back then," she told me quietly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the crowd. "I've had it sitting on an old memory card ever since. There's a reporter here covering your opening. I asked him if he'd let people see it live right now while I still got the nerve to let it go. I've just carried it long enough." I nodded, and the reporter aired it right there on the sidewalk, live, grainy footage of a young woman dragging a suitcase down a driveway in the worst heat of a Houston July, a baby crying against her chest. The crowd around the screen went quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet on my parents' porch a year earlier. Not shocked exactly, but tender, the particular hush of people recognizing something true. It was right at that moment that my parents' car pulled up along the curb. They didn't come because 2 years of quiet reflection had finally cracked something open in either of them. They came because my father's business had collapsed completely, and there was nowhere else left for either of them to turn. My mother stepped out of the car and went pale the instant she saw her own image playing on the reporter's screen, one hand flying up to cover her mouth. My father stood frozen beside her, one hand still on the car door, his eyes moving slowly from the screen to the crowd to the building behind me, like a man trying to add up a sum that kept coming out wrong no matter how many times he ran it. I noticed distantly that his shoulders had a permanent stoop to them now, that they hadn't had a year before. The same posture I realized that I used to carry out of that house myself. The posture of somebody who has finally run out of rooms to stand tall in. Zion ran up and took my hand without me even calling him over, and he smiled up at his grandmother the easy, forgiving way only a small child can, entirely unaware of everything the sight of her cost me. My mother sank down slowly onto the low brick edge of the sidewalk planter, her legs seeming to simply give out under her, and no words came out of her at all. My father didn't move to help her up. He just stood there, watching the two of them small and still against the noise of the crowd and the smell of cornbread and the sound of children laughing somewhere behind me in the yard I'd built out of a piece of land they'd once tried to sell out from under all of us. I didn't walk toward her. I picked my son up onto my hip, and I turned and I carried him back inside my own kitchen, leaving the door open behind me on purpose, open just enough that anyone standing outside, my mother included, could see clearly what the place they had once tried so hard to erase me from had actually become. Full, warm, loud with other people's laughter. That evening, once the crowd had thinned, I stepped out back and looked up at the wide Houston sky going orange over the rooftops. The same sky I'd looked up at once before, standing at a bus stop with a suitcase and a hungry newborn, and absolutely nothing figured out. Pearl came and stood beside me without saying anything, the way she always did, and after a while she just bumped her shoulder gently against mine. Tomorrow's still coming. She said the same 4 words she'd said to me over a phone container 100 nights before. All I needed now was to keep the door open behind me and let whoever wanted to see what I'd built go on and look. In the end, this story isn't really about Rome or the money or even the porch where it all finally came apart. It's about what a person does with the years nobody else valued. If you're sitting with your own coffee this morning, carrying a name someone in your family made you feel small for, here's what I'd say to you, neighbor to neighbor. Don't wait for the apology before you let yourself rest. Call the one person in your address book who never once made you feel like a burden today before lunch and just say thank you out loud. Keep a small jar somewhere in your kitchen the way Pearl did, and let it remind you that people notice more than you think. If a grandchild or a friend still shows up on your porch swing on a Sunday, let that be enough proof that your years counted without needing the ones who left to say so. And if there's a door in your life still closed to someone who once hurt you, you don't have to open it today. You're allowed to just leave your own door open instead and let your life speak for itself.